So good morning. Thank you for having us here. We're going to be talking a bit about the transformative impact of Robo advice or digital advisors. And just by way of background, our paper really grew out of the fundamental question of whether or not a Robo advisor, digital advisor, can be a fiduciary. 2 years ago, there was, as robo-advisors were gaining in popularity and gathering assets, there was some regulatory focus on that question. And we essentially asserted that robos could be fiduciaries, that the concept of fiduciary duty is a common law concept based on duty of loyalty, duty of care, but it's a flexible concept. You know, one of the reasons it's stayed throughout so many years is because it's able to flexibly adapt to different business models. And so our view was that while there are definitely some changes in terms of how investment advice is delivered, fundamentally the regulatory framework, both from the SEC side and from the common law side, didn't need to change dramatically. So our paper talks a bit about what a robo-advisor is and what was motivating the tremendous growth in this space. And then discusses the concept of fiduciary advice and fiduciary duty in broader context.
So to speak through what robos are and just give a little bit more context, as Olivia was saying, robos are investment advisors that use algorithms and technology to offer discretionary investment advice, predominantly through a digital interface, which is web-based or through a mobile application. So the form there, and I think this is critical, is new, but the underlying substance really isn't. Investment advisors have long offered discretionary managed accounts to a retail client base where investments are based on model portfolios that are defined and constructed by portfolio managers. But in leveraging technology, robos are the 21st century application or evolution of this long-standing form of investment advice. So to focus a little bit on some of the characteristics of robo-advisors, as I was saying, they operate through predominantly a digital interface. They offer personalized asset allocation services. What that generally means is that at a high level, they aim to match clients defined by their client profile, their demographic information, their financial circumstances, with a portfolio of low-cost investments, generally mutual funds or ETFs that typically offer a lower expense ratio than certain other products, for instance, those that are actively managed. So there's, to a certain extent, a tilt towards a passive investment approach. As we were saying, there's a reliance on algorithms to actually formulate and deliver advice. That means monitoring as well as implementing investment decisions. And somewhat critically, in a distinction from more typical investment advisors, they offer lower fees and account minimums. Flipping to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about some of the growth drivers behind robo-advisors.
Yeah, so as everyone has made the point, I mean, we've seen digital advice and financial tools in the industry for many decades. And so we've been interested to see why digital advice is catching so much fire at this point in time. And what we're really seeing is some of the themes that we've been talking about in the papers that have been submitted. You know, there is, I think, a fundamental lack of confidence in the ability of certain individuals to feel ready and prepared for their retirement. And so one of the things that robo-advice does very effectively is to democratize advice, to expand access to those people who are underserved by the financial advisory community and who are frankly undersaved in terms of their retirement assets. We have also seen one of the significant drivers being just the lack of or decline in the defined contribution, defined benefit services. And so I think retail investors are looking for another alternative both inside their employer-sponsored plans and outside of it. And increasingly, so much of retirement assets are in IRAs. And so clients and individuals are really looking for another source of advice that's at a low-cost solution. Many of the traditional advisory services have high barriers to entry in terms of the fees. and they don't adequately scale the services, and so you can pay 125 basis points for access to an individual registered rep who can sit down with you and go through a full financial plan and recommend various investment options, but not everybody needs that level of service, and not everybody is willing to pay that type of fee. I would say the most dramatic growth driver that we've seen in this space has really been the technological advances on the user interface and the user experience, because it's really the combination of all of the features that have historically been offered in the investment advice community paired with this technology that makes the interface much more intuitive and much more accessible than it ever has been. And that, combined with the fact that increasingly investors are much more comfortable conducting their financial life through their phones, has really made this a much more popular form of advice.
To talk through briefly how the business model has evolved, we've seen what typifies robo-advisors, but consistent with their exponential growth over the last few years, there's been an evolution of the business model. One of the key developments has been the introduction of a hybrid model, where in addition to interaction with an investment advisor through a predominantly digital interface, human advisors step into the mix and supplement the provision of that digital investment advice. And that can take a number of different forms, but as a general matter, robo-advisors have found that to a certain extent, sometimes clients need a little bit of hand-holding, be it explanation of the underlying nature of the investments that are going into their portfolio, and in other circumstances, helping clients iterate through the account opening process and deciding what their financial circumstances are. A second key focus has been the development and forward-looking development of account aggregation. And so what that means is robo-advisors will aim to aggregate consumer financial information that's obtainable from clients through their other relationships with other financial service providers, their banking relationships, their credit card relationships, and other loans. By aggregating that information and linking it into a robo-advisor's client account, that robo-advisor has visibility into a whole range of micro habits of the client, their spending habits, their current credit card balances. What that enables robo-advisors to do is to offer or potentially offer ever more tailored advice so that it can skew or tilt towards more comprehensive financial planning, or the idea that robo-advisors through a digital interface can offer holistic financial planning. Moving forward, as we were sort of indicating earlier, as Jen was indicating earlier, one of the most contentious issues originally was around whether or not robo-advisors were either fiduciaries or could meet the high level of fiduciary standard. Investment advisors have typically been held under the common law to be fiduciaries, meaning they occupy a position of trust in relation to their clients under common law jurisprudence set by the courts. In the United States, investment advisors are fiduciaries by operation of law. Under the U.S. Investment Advisors Act of 1940 and applicable case law, there's a fiduciary standard that investment advisors are subject to. Registered investment advisors, or those that are registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission at the federal level, are subject to a federal fiduciary standard that is applied by law and under applicable Supreme Court precedent, and then also clarified by the SEC staff in certain guidance.
And it's really that guidance that much of our paper focuses on in terms of the themes that are relevant. You know, as assets and interest in digital advice have increased, so has the focus of the regulators. And digital advice really sits at the intersection of retail and technology, which are two very significant themes broadly, but also themes that the SEC is pulling together in its focus on retail investors and protecting Mr. and Mrs. 401k. And so what we've seen is the SEC focus on these concepts of acknowledging that advice can be provided through a variety of different business models, and that you can, by contract, narrow the scope of the business and the service that you're offering, and then the fiduciary duty really flows from that relationship. They have also sort of reinforce this idea that you can have more limited advisory services and focus substantially on disclosure, ensuring that clients understand the scope of services that are being provided and the limitations of that advice. And we most recently saw this in an SEC release that was published on the 18th of April dealing with fiduciary duties for investment advisors, where they really reaffirmed some of these principles in terms of the scope and flexibility of the fiduciary duty. I guess the last point would just be that this is an area where we continue to see focus, including through the examination process. And I think that the regulators and the SEC in particular are trying to get their arms around the business model and what the potential risks associated with that business model are. One of the key areas, as I said, is on disclosure. Another is on compliance programs and the governance around the algorithms that are used to formulate investment advice. So I think there will be much more to come in this space as the regulators continue to digest and assimilate this new business model. Thank you.
Thank you.